Good morning. This is Chair French convening the regular business meeting of the Kansas Corporation Commission for Thursday, May 29th. I'm joined by my colleagues, Commissioner Keene and Commissioner Keither. On today's agenda, we have a consent agenda consisting of 15 items. We have one order that has been noticed as a noticed item, and then we also have one discussion item, our quarterly update on SPP activities with our new Director of Utilities, Justin Grady. We will begin with our consent agenda. Commissioners, you've had the opportunity to review those 15 consent agenda items. Let me ask at this time if you have any questions, beginning with Commissioner Keither
No questions.
and Commissioner Keene.
No questions from me either. I am recusing on consent agenda item number 1. Noting that recusal, I would move the approval of the consent agenda.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second to approve the consent agenda, noting Commissioner Keene's recusal on item number 1. Is there any further discussion on that motion? Hearing none, all in favor, please vote aye.
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 Aye. Any opposed say no. The consent agenda is approved. We now move to our one noticed item. This is in docket number 25 CONS 3040 CMSC. And this is a proposed order in that docket. And our presenter for this item is Mr. John Myers.
Good morning, Chair French, and good morning, Commissioners. So the order before you finds that more likely than not, the fluids coming to surface in this situation are coming up through an abandoned well of the nature contemplated by KSA 55179, and the order directs both staff and operator to each make a filing within the next 30 days, recommending specific near-term steps to specifically locate the abandoned well and plug it with minimal damage to the nearby structure. With that, I am available for any questions.
All right, thank you, Mr. Myers. Are there any questions on this item, beginning again with Commissioner Keither
No questions.
and Commissioner Keene?
No questions. I have a brief comment, however. The factual setting makes this a very complex and challenging docket. There's evidence, obviously, of oil seepage to the surface. However, thus far, an abandoned well has not been located. Furthermore, the seepage, to complicate things, is around the perimeter of a large commercial building with a heavily reinforced foundation or footing because of the nature of the equipment that's being stored and repaired there. So we've had an evidentiary hearing. However, fact finding thus far it seems remains to be further extended or concluded, and certainly some reflection upon what it is that we would take as the logical next step needs to be considered. So in essence, as Mr. Myers suggested, we are requesting that staff and the operator both provide further input about possible solutions that we might have to this very vexing problem. And as the ordering clause suggests, we're requesting that the operator and the staff that they discuss these issues amongst themselves so that we can maybe come to a resolution of this vexing problem, protect the environment, and do so in a way that's responsible with respect to all the property rights that are involved. As I say, the most difficult problem here is not only it's locating what appears to be an abandoned well. The probabilities are certainly weighed in favor of that being the case. And then once discovered, figuring out some way to go about plugging it and cutting off the potential for pollution of the fresh water. Having said that, I would move approval of the order.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second to approve the order as described in this docket. Is there any further discussion on that motion? Hearing none, all in favor, please vote aye.
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 Aye. Any opposed say no. The order is approved. Thank you, Mr. Myers. We now move to our final item noticed on today's agenda, and that is a discussion item, which is a quarterly update on Southwest Power Pool activities. And for that, we turn to Mr. Justin Grady. And Justin, I believe you have a presentation, and I don't know if you or IT is sharing it, but I'll let you I'll let you negotiate that.
Well, I'm gonna try to share it. Let's see here. What are you able to see right now, if you don't mind?
You.
I do not see anything shared yet.
Well, then we're not starting off too hot here. Let's see.
Justin, click share, and then under application windows, you should see the PowerPoint slideshow.
All right. So how's it working out now?
Nothing.
Okay. Give me a second. Now,
Oh yeah, we've got movement now. All right, we can see it. You just need to make it full screen. That perfect.
okay, are we good?
Yep.
Sorry about that.
You're good.
Well, good morning, everyone. So Justin Grady, Director of Utilities, for those who may be listening in online and don't know me. Good morning, everyone, and looking forward to doing this update this quarter. I missed it last quarter, which was entirely my fault. We had some availability issues trying to get this on the calendar. Just a reminder that the commissioners do have that presentation. I've been back over that presentation as well, and if there's any questions from any of the materials that were included in that, we could certainly go through those today if we need to. And some of the topics that we're going to discuss there is overlap. So for the agenda, we really only have one FERC item to discuss in detail this meeting or this quarter, and it's a relatively recent one. So on May 22nd, a week ago, SPP filed the Expedited Resource Adequacy Study filing with FERC. And we're going to talk about this in quite a bit of detail here this morning. It's a very consequential policy and tariff approval that occurred over the last quarter through both the Regional State Committee and the board. We'll go into more detail about the filing itself, and then we'll talk about some of the analysis and support that SPP staff did to basically support to recommend to the Regional State Committee that the RSC approve the ERIS process and the proposal. So we'll go into the details of what all that means, and then we'll talk about the recent Regional State Committee business meeting and the SPP Board of Directors meeting, and talk about the decisions and approvals that were made there. Okay, so with regard to ERIS, it was filed in docket number ER 25-2296. The first bullet point there is, I guess, an important one in that just a few days prior to when SPP filed this filing, FERC rejected a somewhat similar filing from MISO. Now we've had discussions with SPP staff, and there's been communication that SPP is optimistic, I guess cautiously so, but they believe that their filing is sufficiently different and differentiated from MISO's, and there's a real hope of approval of FERC approval. There has been a previous approval. FERC previously approved somewhat similar proposals from PJM and CAISO, other FERC approved RTO regions, and so there is a hope that this will be approved. Just at a high level, what is ERIS? Well, it is it's and the name, as the name suggests, it's an expedited resource adequacy study process. And so when the board approved, first starting with the approval of the 2026 planning reserve margin, and then culminating with the approval of the increase to the 2029 planning reserve margin, I think by and large, every load serving entity within SPP agreed with the decisions to increase those planning reserve margins. But the concerns that were addressed or raised were that a 5-year period of time is just either too short or very, very close to being too short to actually get generation resources online. And so the concern is that by the time you add up the timeline of going through a regulatory process to get approval to add resources, and then by the time you get approval from the Southwest Power Pool to actually connect to the transmission system, and you add in, supply chain concerns and actually constructing the generation, the concern was that everybody recognized the resource adequacy need in the region, but the concern was that 4 or 5 years just wasn't enough time to get generation online. So SPP and SPP staff heard those concerns and responded in an affirmative fashion. And essentially what they created was this expedited resource adequacy study proposal. And what it does is it allows load serving entities in the region to have a special sort of one-off, one-time only generation interconnection study process in which they don't have to go through the regular generation interconnection queue in order to get their generators studied and attached or hooked up to the transmission system. And the general idea being that if this works as expected and hopefully approved by FERC on time, then load serving entities will essentially be able to hook up generation about 6 months faster than they otherwise would be able to if everything went perfectly through the other generation interconnection queue processes. Basically, if you already have a generator in the 2024 GI queue and there are no restudies and those generators progress through that study process and get a generation interconnection agreement, basically the fastest that process would take place would be in the third quarter of 2026. And this process is designed to hopefully get those generators approval and the ability to connect to the transmission system in the first quarter of 2026, or at least to have a generation interconnection agreement that allows the load serving entity to move forward with its planning and its construction activities. The specifics here in terms of, you can see what the concerns were that FERC expressed with MISO's proposal. And I think just in general, MISO's proposal was a little less bounded, a little less defined, a little more open-ended, and it wasn't quite as limited as SPP's is. And so you can see the specific sort of limitations there on bullet point 4. The first, probably most important one is that, a load serving entity, LRE is load responsible entity, but a load responsible entity or load serving entity basically has to have a projected capacity deficit. In other words, a true resource adequacy need through the year 2030 that otherwise can't be met from other resources that are currently in the queue or that are currently being planned by the utility. Those resources have to have a commercial operation date within 5 years. They have to request the most robust deliverable service, the Network Resource Interconnection Service, and ultimately it's a one-time limited process. And then, maybe secondarily importantly, or perhaps the most important, what SPP really believes is going to be the key is that in the SPP region, the regional state committee, for which Chair French serves on that committee, the regional state committee has FERC recognized authority over resource adequacy issues. And so, when the board has approved changes to resource adequacy accreditations or levels of certain minimums, then those first have to go through the regional state committee. That is the process. That's the RSC has that authority. And what the RSC has said unanimously is that we need this, right? In our region, there's a true resource adequacy need. And for a lot of reasons, we need to provide this tool to load serving entities to be able to bring generation online faster in order to meet that need for resource adequacy. So there's more detail that we'll go into later in the presentation. This is just sort of the high level overview of the filing. Chair, is there anything that you'd like to add or supplement or correct?
Definitely not correct. The only thing I would add, this is a really good recap of those differences. I think there is one other key difference, and it's probably related to that number 4 and the authority of the states in the SPP region. And I think this is noted in SPP's transmittal letter to FERC. Within MISO and PJM, I can certainly understand a concern from FERC that, look, you're letting essentially the utilities, the load serving entities, jump past other people in the queue, other people maybe being independent power producers, folks that don't have a customer base to serve. You're letting them jump past. And that might be a problem in MISO and PJM, and particularly discriminatory in those areas because they have what's known as a capacity market that anybody can, once you build generating capacity, you can bid into that market, and it's a big competitive process. Well, in SPP, we don't have a capacity market. We just have load serving entities they are the only ones obligated to serve load. They're the only ones that have customers. They're the only ones obligated to carry capacity. And it's up to them to just go out and bilaterally contract for capacity. And often that includes going out and making deals with independent power producers who have developed projects. So I think that's a key difference to me, why this is certainly less discriminatory in an SPP context than it would be in a region that has a competitive capacity market where truly utilities and independent developers are competing to supply capacity for the whole region, where in SPP, it is really only on the load serving entities to supply that capacity. So that would just be, I think that falls within number 4, but to me that is a key difference as well. I would hope FERC might defer to SPP and the sort of the authority the states have retained over generating capacity.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I guess just one other quick note is that the current chair of FERC, Mark Christie, previous state commissioner, did write a dissent, and he voted that, or he opined that he would have approved MISO's filing and did vote in support of that. So we're hopeful. SPP is requesting a 60-day approval timeline, and then that process will kick off later this year if approved. Okay, so on slide 4, this is just the high-level overview of what was approved at the RSC business meeting. Each of these items was in turn also approved by the board. What the numbers here represent is the voting. You can see, and I've noted whether that was an abstention or an opposition, and we'll talk about each one of these bullet points in more detail here through the presentation. Okay, so the delivery point rule. This used to be referred to as the wind allocation rule. And basically what it is it's a protection for zones, and by that I mean pricing zones, geographic areas in which transmission costs would have been allocated but for this rule. And it's a situation where if a load serving entity builds a resource, a generation resource, outside of its zone, and then requests transmission service, and those transmission upgrades are base plan funded, then without a rule like this, then basically those transmission assets could be cost allocated to a different zone than the benefiting load, right? Basically, the classic example is something like Kansas City Power and Light builds a wind farm out in western Kansas, requests transmission service of that for that resource, and then the wind rule or the delivery point rule for wind would basically protect that host zone from bearing the costs of those transmission upgrade costs. Well, what became known and understood from pretty much everybody was that that it became less and less justifiable to have that rule only apply to wind resources, right? People started to realize, solar resources might also be built in a different zone versus the delivery, the benefiting load zone. And the smaller the zone or the subregion, it could also be possible that you would build a thermal resource, just over the border or just over the physical location of the zone. And so ultimately, what was approved both originally by the cost allocation working group and then the regional state committee and the board was basically to make this rule fuel neutral. So this is now a completely fuel neutral cost allocation protection concept. And it just says, look, and we'll go to the specifics on the next slide. You can see in that fourth bullet point there, it's essentially now going to be applied on a sub-regional basis versus a zonal basis. But if you are a delivery point in the central subregion, somewhere in the central subregion, and you're building a resource in the southeast subregion in Oklahoma, and the result of that causes an increase in transmission costs, instead of the subregion bearing those costs, the region will bear 67% of those costs, and 33% will be borne by the direct assigned to the entity that is doing the requesting. Or that's building the generation resource and requesting the transmission service. And so there was some debate as to whether or not 33% direct assignment and 67% to the region is the right number. I actually think there will continue to be policy debate and discussion about potentially changing those numbers. But the first step was just to make it fuel neutral and to recognize that this is one of those legacy tariff issues. It probably should have never been just for wind in the first place. And I think the reality is that it's just a situation that at the time, the only resources that anybody was building outside of the benefiting zone was wind. And so the delivery point rule ended up being rolled into the tariff implementation of the HIT C1 policy. And, HIT C1 is something that we've discussed several times on these previous quarterly updates. You can see the configuration of the subregions and the areas, the geographic areas within the service territory there in that map. This was something that was very important to Kansas, and Kansas stakeholders were very, very supportive of this. Missouri ended up supporting it as well. And it's ultimately the reality now is that when transmission upgrades are made between 100 and 300 kV kilovolts, those will no longer be allocated just to the zone that they happen to be located in. Instead, they will be cost allocated across the entire region, or the subregion. Sorry, the subregion. So, the situation, the classic example of Midwest or Sunflower Energy out in Western Kansas, as we all know, the struggles that they've had with additional transmission investment being built in their area to support the build out of renewable energy. And so this is a situation where now those transmission costs will be cost allocated to the central region, which, the transmission planning and engineering studies have confirmed that that's essentially where power is flowing. It's flowing west to east through the central region. So we talked about this before. The policy was approved. It was approved by COG last September. It was approved by the RSC last February, and this is just the implementation of the tariff. And at this point now, this will go on to FERC and be a FERC filing. It's probably appropriate to note that this was opposed by Louisiana and Texas, and so it may very well be, I mean, we don't know, but there's a possibility that it could be opposed at FERC by those states. And so this is far from over, but it's definitely going in the right direction. And we're pleased to see it be approved recently. Chair, do you have anything to add?
No, that's a good summary. I think the key points is well, we probably, as we said on past calls, it probably would have made more sense to have something like 3 zones, to have Nebraska and the North Zone be connected and have those 2 southern zones be connected. But that doesn't really impact us whether they were consolidated or not. And the stakeholders in those areas weren't ready for that to happen. But this is definitely an improvement. The biggest thing is it just reflects how operations are actually occurring today, particularly across Kansas and Missouri, and that we are seeing that those energy flows go among all of those Kansas and Missouri zones. And so it definitely aligns costs much closer with benefits, and addresses a lot of the concerns we've heard from stakeholders. So positive movement. And again, yeah, this is just implementing the tariff language.
Okay. So the provisional load process, this was not really a controversial approval. So this is not the tariff language yet, I don't think, or maybe I can't really recall. I can't recall if this was the policy or if it's the tariff language. But in any case, what this does, the purpose of the provisional load process is this is essentially an alternative process to study load, either load additions or delivery point changes, in which it's an alternative to using the process that's laid out in attachment AQ. Okay, and attachment AQ to the SPP tariff essentially defines the process of studying and evaluating the reliability of the ability to serve load and to serve new load. And so today, the way this process works is if Evergy or another load serving entity wants to add a new large load customer, or any customer really, significant load addition, then they submit the process through attachment AQ to SPP. SPP's interpretation of their requirements under the tariff is that they go out and verify that the load serving entity has enough generation online today to serve that new load, plus the planning reserve margin requirements over each of the next 10 years. And so the reality is, in the resource adequacy environment that we're in, and that we've talked about a lot, shrinking actual reserve margins and less excess capacity or ability to serve new load, the reality is that those requests to add new load were being denied. And so the utility was saying it was somewhat of a chicken or an egg thing. If I don't get this customer approved through the AQ process, I can't get approved from my regulator to add new generation. And so this is the process that was identified. Essentially, what this will allow is it will allow a customer, a new load, to be approved with planned expected generation that the load serving entity is expecting to put online in that 10-year period of time. And then the backstop for customers and for the rest of the region essentially is that if there are network upgrades that are needed associated with bringing that customer online, even though the expectation is that you will have generation to serve them, then those network upgrades are going to be directly assigned to the transmission customer, essentially the load serving entity, until that load serving entity receives firm transmission service for its planned generation. Once that generation comes online and firm transmission service is granted, then at that point, the traditional cost allocation regime would kick in, which would allow those costs to be base plan funded. So through attachment AQ today, if you have enough excess generation to serve your customer over the next 10 years, and yet still the network is not robust enough to serve that customer, then that's a network upgrade, meaning that essentially the whole region or the whole zone, the whole sub-region benefits from that network upgrade, and that is base plan funded. And so anyway, provisional load process was also approved by the RSC and by the board on the May 5th meeting. Okay, so now we're going to get a little higher level here. This was also a pretty important policy approval by the RSC and by the board. You can see there was no opposition. There was only one abstention, which was Louisiana in terms of the Regional State Committee. The consolidated planning process is what CPP stands for. And I'm going to do my best to provide a high level sort of executive summary overview of what this entails and why SPP is doing it, what the benefits are that we see for the region and for the state. And then because Chair French serves on the Consolidated Planning Process Task Force, he's going to correct me and or supplement where needed. What is the CPP? Well, Consolidated Planning Process is essentially that. It's a consolidation of what currently exists as multiple sort of separate, independent and relatively siloed planning processes. So today, transmission is planned and could potentially get a notice to construct out of several different independent planning processes. So that ranges from the integrated transmission plan, which is probably the biggest, most overriding, general transmission planning process, but also the generation interconnection process transmission can be planned and come out of that, or the attachment AQ process, or the aggregate study process. And the reality is that each of those planning processes are essentially producing transmission that has been optimized for whatever the assumptions are that go into that study, and based on whatever the cost allocation results are that come out of that study. And so, a perfect example is a situation where, as you know, if a generator, whether it be a renewable energy generator or a thermal generator, if a generator wants to connect to the transmission system and it causes costs associated with that, the request to connect, then that generator is directly assigned those costs, okay? And because of that, I've heard it described as a situation where this is a race that you never want to win. You always want to be second. And that's because if you win the race and you want to connect a generator, SPP does the transmission study and they say, well, unfortunately, you have to pay for $100 million upgrade in order to connect that generator to the transmission grid. And so what happens is the generator drops out. That causes a series of restudies, and now maybe somebody else gets the bill for the transmission upgrade, and that person drops out. And in part, that is in part related to and associated with some of the delays that we've seen in the generation interconnection queue process, right? The other thing is it results in a lot of instances in which generators can't afford to connect to the transmission system because $100 million transmission upgrade isn't in the economics of their transmission, or I'm sorry, of their generation project. It doesn't make it economically viable. And so what happens then is generators oftentimes will submit several different generation interconnection requests on several different transmission lines, and they try to find the one that doesn't break the system, essentially. They try to find the one that has additional capacity that would allow where SPP will allow them to connect without any additional network upgrades. And so this is not just an SPP problem. This is an open access transmission study problem, and it's the way it works. And so as a result, what has happened, we'll go into some more detail in a few slides, but as a result, what has happened is that generators that are seeking to interconnect to the transmission system have really not contributed that much to the overall contribution of the transmission grid. About $800 million over the last 10 years on over $10 billion worth of transmission that's been planned and built. And so what the consolidated planning process does is the idea is we're gonna plan transmission upgrades through one big consolidated optimized planning process. We're going to evaluate and identify the types of generators that are expected to be online in the next 10 years and the next 20 years. And if those generators want to be part of that transmission build and that transmission upgrade, then they're going to pay. We're going to cost allocate the result of the transmission upgrades according to the space that you take up on those transmission lines. So it's no longer a situation where generators are trying to be second in line. Now it doesn't matter what your place in line is. We're gonna broadly, holistically plan the transmission grid, and we're gonna more fairly cost allocate the costs. And the idea is that the expectation right now is that generators will pay about twice as much as they have historically to have access and the ability to interconnect to the transmission system. So I'm going to go into some more detail in the next two slides, Chair, I'm sure you can provide some additional context or clarification to that overly wordy, high-level explanation of what the CPP entails.
Nope, that was a perfect explanation. And what this vote is all about and why it's so important is, figuring out exactly how we calculate what we're going to charge those generators. That's what unlocks this whole ability to plan together and to cost allocate better, is to get a good a correct allocation of costs so you can create a charge for generators. So no, that's a great explanation.
Justin, if I may.
Absolutely.
Yes, please. First of all, congratulations on your promotion to the Director of Utilities. It's a very consequential event for the Commission. Well-deserved promotion for you. We're all grateful for the service that Jeff McClanahan provided in that role, and we look forward to working with you as you proceed as Director of Utilities. So congratulations for that, Justin.
Thank you, Commissioner.
As you suggested, this is high level. Okay. I'm trying to get some of the biggest crayons I can out of the box so that I can follow this. But let me ask you a couple of overview questions. It strikes me from what we were just discussing with the previous slide and the discussion incidental to that we're looking at having multiple autonomous transmission planning entities. And so my question is, how are these coordinated to prevent exponential rate increases? And a kind of a related question to that is, when and how are the cost considerations involved with respect to all of these different transmission planning processes going to be balanced with what's going to be an inevitable impact on rates?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So I'm going to do my best, and I think when we get into the next couple slides, it's going to help a little. But I think probably foremost that the first thing I need to point out is the existing independent or autonomous, if you want to say it like that, study processes exist today. Right. So today and, over the last 15 years or 20 years since SPP has been a regional transmission organization, this is the status quo is that there is the integrated transmission plan. There's the generation interconnection process, attachment AQ, aggregate study, and probably a few other studies that I can't remember right now. Now, the key is that what moving forward, the plan is to, instead of performing multiple independent, separate siloed transmission plans, the idea is let's just do one plan that finds the optimal solution that will fulfill the needs of each of those other four separately, independently planned transmission processes. Right. And so I think, the key is, I think you're more likely to have larger, higher voltage, more optimal type plans that come out of this process, because before SPP, might have planned two separate 230 kV projects, both of which have, landowner impact and rate impacts. And instead, a 345 kV project with one set of landowners impacted and cost allocated across the entire region would have met the same or perhaps better engineering transmission planning processes. I think that is a big part of the concept, is that instead of, allowing, if a generator, the example of being second in line or third in line is real, right? And so if there's a transmission line out there that has made it through the rigorous transmission study process and meets all the benefit cost analysis, but then creates excess capacity on the transmission system, then the reality for the last 20 years is that a generator can come in and use the capacity on that system. And that's the FERC policy. That's the open access transmission tariff policy. That's the FERC policy. And what this is trying to do is get away from that essentially free ridership, the way some people consider it, and not unfairly so. And to say, look, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to plan holistically. And if you want to interconnect to the transmission system, then you're going to pay a grid contribution fee. You're going to pay a generalized rate for interconnection infrastructure development, which is what GRID stands for, I think, plus or minus an I. And the result is that all the expectations are that generators are actually going to pay about twice as much as they have in the past for this transmission development. And I think that's the important element of the second part of your question, which is how are costs accounted for, and what are the guardrails to guard against exponential rate increases. I don't see it that the consolidated planning process is going to result in more transmission investment or less economic or less beneficial transmission investment. I actually think it'll be more targeted, better optimal solutions. And then ultimately, there will not be generators that connect to the transmission system any longer and just use up free capacity. That's not going to happen. They're going to have to pay for their utilization of the transmission system. So the way that what's on this slide, the way the calculation is going to work is that SPP is going to evaluate the generators that want to connect over the next 10 years, over the next 20 years. They're going to make them pay non-refundable significant fees to be in that process. And then they're going to make them pay for their projected utilization of the transmission system on an hour-by-hour basis as determined through economic dispatch of the system. And so that's as best as I can provide the detail at, to this slide, and we'll get into a little more in the next slide. Chair, I don't know if you have anything additional, and Commissioner Keen, hopefully I've done your question justice.
I appreciate your response, Justin. I think I'm going to kind of hold follow-on questions to give you an opportunity to work your way through some of the slides yet to come here, which may preclude having you say something twice.
Okay. So the two boxes here are what has been approved at this point on a policy level by both the RSC and the board. And I attempted to sort of step through some of this, but it's so for ERIS, which is Energy Resource Interconnection Service. And this is probably your classic, merchant generator that, maybe has a corporate client in the region that has, particular energy mix goals or clean energy goals, whatever it is. And they really only want to provide energy on an as needed or as available basis. They're really interested in, essentially harvesting production tax credits and providing energy capability when it's available. But they're not making any expectations about, or they're not making any promises about being available at peak or, providing much capacity credit to the region. And so this is a situation where, again, the transmission sites, the generation sites will essentially be planned and will be part of this consolidated planning process. And if you want to connect to the transmission grid, you're going to pay a per kilowatt or essentially a per kilowatt charge, reflecting the expected utilization that you will expect to utilize of the transmission grid. And there are no free riders, and that's the way it works. Now the NRIS calculation is a little different. It's the Network Resource Interconnection Service, and these are your firm capacity resources that are expected to be there to provide, service at peak when the resources needed the most during the hottest days in the summer and the coldest days in the winter. It will be an adder on top of the ERIS connection, and it's expected to be more expensive because the transmission infrastructure that's necessary to plan to be able to serve peak resources is higher. It's a more deliverable service. It will essentially guarantee the ability to deliver your generator within the deliverability regions. And as a result, that's one of the reasons why costs, are going to be basically delivered or allocated to the deliverability regions. And they will be allocated to the deliverability regions in the central region. And so there's two cost components. We can get into, and I don't have it in these slides today, but the specific, the formulas and the detail that goes into each of these is much, much more detailed, and it's certainly available, and we can talk about it at some point if we need to. Chair, is there anything that you need to add or want to add yet?
Just, I mean, the only thing I was thinking is just to put that ERIS, INRIS in a little more layman's terms, is just the ERIS service, as Justin said, it's cheaper, that charge is going to be cheaper. And it's because those people that are signing up for that service really are saying, it's not quite this simple, but they're basically saying, I'm willing to kind of take the grid as it is, and if there's not enough capacity at any particular time, you can curtail me. I'll turn myself off. And that's because they're not serving any load. The NRIS, as Justin said, it's going to be more expensive because that person is saying, I don't want the grid to ever turn me off. I need to be able to deliver my electrons to my load. And so I am willing to pay for you to build out the grid more robustly to accommodate my megawatts. And so that's kind of the difference. It's not quite that simple, but that's at a super high level, that's the difference between those, and that's why the NRIS charge is going to have an adder to reflect the additional investment that's necessary to make those megawatts deliverable to their customers.
So on this slide, on slide 25, this is the idea. This is what we were talking about before about the, you can call it a free rider situation where, which I think is not all that different from really a lot of other infrastructure upgrades in our society. I mean, a city, a forward planning city may very well build a 4-lane highway, or not a highway, a 4-lane road with an industrial park. And they do that to try to attract investment. And then when that investment shows up, then they use up that infrastructure and then they build again. It's so, but still people have concerns about the ability of, if you plan and build a transmission line whose primary optimized purpose is to serve load, and then generators show up behind it and fill up that capacity. Well, there are definitely parties that have expressed real concern about that. And that's one of the issues that this process and policy is attempting to solve. So on this slide, you can see that, there have been approximately 67 gigawatts, 67,000 megawatts of generation planned and hooked up to the transmission grid in the last 20 years on the SPP system. And as we know, again, generators, if they cause network upgrades because they want to connect, then they pay for those network upgrades, and they pay about $800 million. And so if you do that math, if you divide $800 million by 67,000 kilowatts, that comes out at about $12, $11.90 a kilowatt. And you can see the range is represented there somewhere between $7.2 and $12.5 a kilowatt. The expectation, and all of the, the calculations in the study and what has been presented to policymakers for the decision point is that, the midpoint that is expected right now of the ERIS contribution would be $22 a kilowatt. So all the things being equal, we're planning to charge generators about twice as much as previously afforded or realized as realized for the privilege to being able to hook up to the transmission system. But what generators receive from this in the development community is they receive certainty. They receive they no longer have to continuously test the GIQ and submit 5 different projects and on 5 different transmission lines to try to find the place where they don't have to incur network upgrades. And if they get unlucky, then no, you need to pay for $100 million upgrade to a transmission system. And so that's the bargain, right? It's load gets the bargain of generators are going to contribute about twice as much to the transmission system. Also, load gets the idea of planning certainty. And by load, I mean load serving entities. Load serving entities, some of them want to contract with these generators that are out there that want to connect to the transmission grid. And previously, there's been very low degree of likelihood or certainty or predictability about exactly which generators are actually going to be there and connected to the transmission system in 5 years. The reality is that when you see 100,000 megawatts that wants to hook up to the transmission grid in the 2024 GIQ, nobody really expects that all of that's going to be connected. It's going to be something like 10,000 or 15,000 megawatts. And it's because of the issues that we've been talking about. And this process is aiming to fix that. Just real quick, in terms of NRIS upgrades, you see that, I mentioned earlier, well, that's expected to be a more robust, a more expensive product. And so, one of the observations might be, well, why has that historically been cheaper? And that's because the types of generators that have been hooking up to the system over the last 20 years have in large part been the types of generators that don't seek NRIS service. And so they only essentially seek it if it's free or close to free, with the idea being that's another stated goal of this process is to improve the quality and what it means to have NRIS service and for it to be truly valuable. And then for the entities that request it, and load serving entities will be the entities that request it, then it's going to be a little bit more expensive. Okay, Commissioner Keen, that is the end of my CPP slides. Getting ready to move on to other issues. So just wanted to give you an opportunity for any follow-up.
No, I appreciate that. No follow-up yet. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so this is the planning reserve margin component. Now, the policy of this did pass in February. It was, if not unanimous, nearly unanimous. Well, it was unanimous, I guess. And the only uncertainty or the opposition that did exist throughout the working groups, it was mostly an issue of we can't, that's not soon enough for us to comply. Ultimately that's only 4 years away. And that was a big part of what went into the creation of the ERIS proposal. But all this was a formalization of the planning reserve margins in the tariff. And so at this point, there are not anticipated to be any additional changes to the planning reserve margin. Load serving entities throughout SPP, including Evergy and Midwest Energy and Sunflower and others, have this certainty that, this is the summer planning reserve margin for the next 3 years and the winter planning reserve margin for the next 3 years. And then in 2029, those go up to 17% in the summer and 38% in the winter. So now, integrated resource planning processes have these numbers and they know what they are and they can plan to the best of their ability for the next 5 years, 4 years now. And then it is the 2030 planning reserve margin is being studied currently and will be established and set next year by the Regional State Committee and by the SPP board. This is just the working groups and where they went up through and in terms of the degree of support that was received by the working groups.
Yeah, and Justin, the only thing I might add, I don't know if we presented it at past quarterly presentations, but I think we all agree there's going to be a little more stability around some of these resource adequacy policies moving forward, and in particular, planning reserve margin. But one component of that is that we are now we've sort of approved a new cadence for how we would do it. It used to basically be it was every 2 or 3 years, but if you needed a change, you could make a change at any time. It probably, if there was an emergency, that could still be the case, but right now we are going to have a specific sort of long-term cadence. As Justin mentioned, sort of the short term, the shortest we would plan to ever change the planning reserve margin would be 4 years. I think they're going to do a projection that's like a 10-year lookout that's not binding on anybody, but it gives utilities planning insight. And then we are going to set a binding planning reserve margin 7 years out. But then that is subject to sort of a final adjustment within that last 4 years. So the whole purpose of that is just to give all stakeholders a better long-term view of where planning reserve margins are going in the future, be it up or down. I mean, there are definitely factors that could lead to lower planning reserve margins in the future, depending on what sort of resources we add and how the other variables in those studies look. So it just gives everybody a much better planning horizon and less turbulence than we probably had over the last 5 or 6 years. So that was the only other thing I'd add, Justin.
Yep. Okay. Thanks. Appreciate that. So, all right. Now this next slide, now we're getting into just a little more of the detail about, the policy need for and the support that the RSC relied on and ultimately the SPP relied on in seeking this policy accommodation or tariff accommodation from FERC. So these slides are a little messy or a little busy, and they're not labeled. But what these are 10-year projections that load serving entities submitted to SPP in each of these years from 2017 through 2024. And so, you can follow the color coding by where they start. So this is 2018 and then 19 and 2020, 2021, 22, 23, and 24. And I mean, we could probably spend 30 minutes talking about these graphs, but what the takeaway should be is that for years and years, load serving entities they were dramatically underestimating how much load would be coming onto the system, how quickly, right? So if you see, the 2017 submission, the expectation was that by 2027, there'd be about 55,000 megawatts of load on the system. Well, the actual peak in the summer had, hit almost 57,000 megawatts in 2023, right? So now, as you see, each year they're sort of catching up. They're trying to catch up to how the load growth has actually been experienced, but it's not been fast enough, right? And so that's not only summer but also winter. And the reality is there really is a lot of load growth occurring. Electrification is occurring throughout SPP. Some of it's electrification of oil and gas exploration. Some of it's reshoring and manufacturing. But for a variety of reasons, we're using more electricity throughout SPP, and the expectation is that that's only going to continue. Now, this slide just sort of shows, well, yeah, okay, so we understand that a 10-year forecast is increasing significantly, but what about the 1-year forecast? And obviously you kind of have to discount what happened during COVID and maybe even a little bit of the rebound in 21. But for a few years, the 1-year out forecast was a little light, or I'm sorry, a little heavy. But then for the more recent years, it's the summer forecast is outpacing significantly what load serving entities expect to happen. It is important to point out this isn't weather normalized. So some of what happened in 2023 may very well have been due to the 5-year or 5-day extreme heat dome effect of all over SPP. It was very hot for 5 days in a row. I think actually 3 out of those 5 days were a brand new peak, which doesn't happen very often. So, but this is what you can see during the winter. It's with a few exceptions, there's a new higher winter peak, almost every year. And so when you consider the fact that load serving entities are having a hard time catching up with how fast load is coming on, as well as the fact that for a long time it took at least 5 years to get through the generation interconnection queue. SPP has made incredible strides. They made incredible improvements. They're down now to the point where if a resource entered the interconnection queue in 2022, they will have the opportunity to receive a generation interconnection agreement in 2025. And of course, SPP is not alone. This is a nationwide issue that there's a lot of reforms and attempted changes occurring to try to improve how quickly you can get through the generation interconnection queue. but the reality has been declining reserve margins, tighter and tighter capacity reserve margins, less and less excess capacity. And it's led to more and more resource adequacy alerts. And, you know, these are things that we talk about all the time and the commission knows. But real quick, this will be a major part of SPP's pitch to FERC to allow these additional generators to interconnect faster and outside of the regular GI process. So what they're saying is that the status quo, the steady state, status quo situation was this blue line. And as a reminder, anytime you get below 16%, that means that you no longer have enough excess capacity in the region to meet the reliability standards of 1 day in 10 years. That is a FERC approved tariff requirement, and basically the entire industry plans their system, transmission and generation, to meet that reliability standard. So SPP has been sounding the alarm about this for years, and the cliff sort of below the point to where we get below the industry accepted reliability standards has been a few years out for about 3 years now. So we've sort of stopped the bleeding, but have not been able to accomplish an improvement in reliability, or to get to a point where we're not expected to have energy emergency alerts or resource adequacy conservation alerts every time it gets above, 95 degrees in SPP. And
Seeing a frozen screen. Am I alone?
No, same here. I think we lost Justin. I was wondering if you all lost me or or vice versa. Okay, we've got Justin back, it looks like.
I'm back. All right. Can you see the slides?
Yes, we see the slides. It does look like we lost our IT, but I'm guessing he will rejoin as he's available. I think you can continue, Justin.
Did you hear that, Chair?
No.
Oh, I just said, what about the streaming service? Do you think we should wait?
I think we are still streaming. At least it says that on my screen.
Yes, I believe we are still streaming.
Okay. I'm going to leave my video off because it keeps saying that my internet is unstable. So we're almost to the end. If something happens with my audio, just let me know, interrupt me, okay? So the yellow line is the situation where this is what load serving entities like Evergy and others have told SPP is, if we could connect all the generation we want to in the next 5 years, then this is the yellow line. Essentially, this is what allows the region to stay above the minimum reliability targets. That's the whole takeaway from this slide, and that's what was relied on by the Regional State Committee and by SPP to support the ERIS plan, the ERIS tariff filing with FERC. And this is just the numbers themselves. These are the kind of deficiencies that LREs are reporting. Some
Justin, I lost you again.
Still
Chair,
meeting.
Chair, can you share the screen?
Yeah, good idea. I can do that. I've got your presentation here.
I think that'll make a difference.
Let me see if I can get it pulled up.
We've only got 3 more slides. We're close.
We can limp through.
Slide
All right.
22.
Do you see it?
Yep.
And am I full screen or do I need to somehow get to full screen?
Yeah, go to slideshow and do the start slideshow. You're not full screen yet.
How's that?
There we go. Thanks. So I'm not sure if this part was caught or not, but some entities within SPP are winter peaking, some are summer peaking. And so you actually have to take the higher of whether it's in the winter or the summer. And that number is the 16,716 megawatts below. And so that's the number that SPP is essentially requesting that amount of additional megawatts be allowed to connect to the system in this sort of one-time special study for resource adequacy purposes. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And this was an attempt to answer the criticism or the question of, well, you have 100,000 megawatts of generation that's in the queue. Why don't you just use that? And SPP's assessment was that if everything went sort of according to plan or maybe according to historical experience, then you might be able to get another 14,000 megawatts hooked up to the transmission system, between now and 2029. But there's no certainty of that. There's no guarantee of that. And I think ultimately what the load serving entities would tell you is that the types of resources that are out there in the queue just don't allow us to meet the actual capacity reserve requirements that we have and that we need, or at least they're not deliverable or they're not economic. And so ultimately that's another part of the FERC tariff, is that the load serving entities have to attest to the fact that they are not aware of an equivalent or comparable resource that's out there, that's in the queue, that would otherwise meet the need that they have determined. All right, next slide. Thanks. And so this is the last slide, and this is just the items that the SPP board of directors approved. And so we've talked through each of these items in some detail. Basically, the first 5 bullet points, I think we talked about quite a bit. The last bullet point was this was the SPP board approving a competitive transmission development project for a 38-mile long, 345 kilovolt, 345,000 volt transmission line in Oklahoma, pursuant to the FERC Order 1000 process. And so the independent expert panel presented their findings and their recommendations. Ultimately, the board made the decision, based on, essentially totally anonymously. They don't know who the bidders are. It's just based on the evaluation that is undertaken through attachment Y of the SPP tariff. And the independent expert panel made the recommendation. Ultimately, the entity that was approved was TransSource Oklahoma, and then the alternative entity that was selected was a partnership between ITC and Oklahoma Gas and Electric.
Justin, the only thing I thought about adding on that, and you can correct me if I'm misremembering the details. Yeah, that's obviously it's a project in Oklahoma. It's not something we're going to have to cite, but I did think it was interesting in that case I believe the winning bid was the lower cost bid. They found basically both entities were capable of building this line, but one of the distinguishing factors was they selected the lowest cost bid, but I believe the other bid was a little higher cost, but they were proposing to use an advanced conductor, which would have created would have been a higher capacity line. Um, Maybe sort of more future proofing that. And the board really struggled with how to weigh those. They asked a lot of questions of the panel, and the panel said, we just didn't know how to value that extra capacity because we asked for a 345 kV line, and one was lower cost than the other. But I only raise it because I think that's going to be an ongoing debate, and I know the board asked the SPP staff to provide them more information for how they could evaluate things like that in the future, because that's advanced conductors are sort of, they fall within that bucket of grid enhancing technologies. And what they could allow is you're building one line with one right of way, and maybe you're overbuilding it a little bit, but maybe you're also not having to build another line 10 years from now using another right of way. And so potentially you're going to future proof the system and minimize future land use. But it's difficult to quantify that when one bid is a lower cost. So it's an interesting question, definitely ties into some of the debates and discussion we've had in Kansas about siting and to what extent some of these new technologies should be used. I just wanted to flag that's something that I know that the SPP board is struggling with, how they should think about that. And I think they would like to be able to value some of those add-on benefits, but it's difficult to know how they should. So Justin, I just wanted to flag that. I think that was the debate that they had, and I thought it might be interesting to the other commissioners.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, the independent expert panel was, sure to point out, or careful to point out, that, the line that they're recommending approval of had a minimum capacity or capability, like 27% above the minimum expectations that were in the RFP. And so, I mean, I think their point was, you asked us to find the best proposal for the line that you wanted, so yeah, I think you're right. That's definitely going to be a topic of future discussion. And, I don't know. I'm sure there are stakeholders that will use that as an opportunity to point out one of the deficiencies or the concerns of the competitive bidding process.
Well, and I'll just say, I mean, it's not a simple issue. There are definitely things about like advanced conductors that are attractive, potentially minimize land use. But at the same time, they are more expensive. I actually also would point out, I was speaking on a panel maybe a couple months ago, and on the panel before me was the head of FERC, Jim Robb, and he sort of spoke, I wouldn't say against, but cautionarily about advanced conductors, just from FERC or NERC's perspective. That creates a bigger contingency on the system. If you have these really big lines and one goes down, that is harder to plan for. So it just goes to show there's a lot of trade-offs depending on technologies, but probably we need to grapple with that issue and figure out where they might be appropriate. So just an interesting discussion that took place, I thought.
That's my last slide. There are some really interesting materials in the appendix. For me, sometimes they're like the most interesting materials. I don't know why I put them in the appendix, but it's in part it's because they're some of the most detailed. But please take a look at those and let me know if you have any questions. Actually, just real quick, shamelessly, Chair, if you wouldn't mind, go to the one that says load to available capacity margin. Okay. So this was a slide that I stole from the market monitoring unit. And I should probably mention I stole every single one of these slides from a previous SPP presentation. But I also stole this one. And this is just, the market monitor, they're independent and they share a lot of the same types of concerns, resource adequacy concerns that that the RSC does, and I think the board. And they present a lot of information. A lot of the information I put in the appendix pertains to operational challenges that occurred during the last year, maybe during the winter or in the first quarter of the year of 2025. But this was an interesting slide. That's why I put it in here. So this is 2024 and load to available capacity margin. Now, what available capacity margin means is actual available to dispatch, available to be committed generation within the region, within the 14 state region. And how did our load in the region compare to what was available? And you can see that in January and in August, both of those instances, that line goes above 100%. And that's not a success story necessarily. That's a situation where the region relied on non-firm imports coming in from other regions through interregional transmission connections. And that's a situation where, but for those connections and the availability of that non-firm power, which is certainly not guaranteed, and you don't build these systems to rely on that, there would have been load shed last January and last August in SPP. So with that rosy picture, I will conclude the presentation and open it up for any questions. I'm sorry I went over.
Justin, if I could, kind of apart from the presentation, and it's quite possible that the question I have, I'm conflating that with that 38-mile line that you just addressed. But is there a more recent notice to construct that affects our area and directly affects Evergy that I thought I had read about? Am I conflating that with this project or?
Well, there is. So there were several notices to construct that came out of the 2024 Integrated Transmission Planning process, the ITP that was approved last November. And so there is some detail, just by way of reference, there's some detail and there are some maps that are included in our fourth quarter update that we did. It would have been 2 quarters ago. The notices to construct that came out of that process were sort of, I don't want to say, almost coincidentally, but they were all directly associated with SPP's winter weather resiliency analysis that was included in the 2024 ITP. And there was a big line that is planned to go from Holcomb, Kansas, roughly. It's the Holcomb substation in western Kansas, southwest Kansas, goes straight up. Actually, I think it terminates in far western Nebraska, but it goes through Colorado. That's the line that I think we spoke quite a bit about in that previous quarterly presentation that was essentially planned to help address some of the operational issues that were identified during Winter Storm Uri. And then there's one other line too, I think that was a Winter Storm Uri line, and that's the Elm Creek to Tobias line. It's a shorter segment line up in north central Kansas. And then a consequential large 154-mile line that is the one that affects Evergy, and that is called the Buffalo Flats to Delaware line. that line was identified in the Winter Storm Elliott winter storm resiliency evaluation and analysis, and that goes from west of Wichita to a substation called Buffalo Flats. I think there's a wind farm there, or right around there, and then it goes southeast. As you know, the SPP doesn't choose routes. They basically draw a straight line, but it terminates at a substation somewhere down in northeast Oklahoma. Evergy is only building the line to the state, to a point of interconnection at the state line. Purpose of that line is to connect to transmission lines that are being built out of southwest Missouri, and they're going southwest down into Oklahoma. And those two lines were identified as part of that Winter Storm Elliott resiliency evaluation, and sort of overlaps with the target area evaluation of southeast Kansas, southwest Missouri, northeast Oklahoma, and northwest Arkansas. And the key is, just quickly, I know this is too long of an answer to your question, but that area of the footprint received a target area identification because during Winter Storm Elliott, as you know, SPP was that storm occurred, Christmas Eve, December of 2022. It was just a little over a year after Winter Storm Uri. And by and large, SPP did not experience load shed like we did during Winter Storm Uri, but the entirety of a big portion of the Eastern Interconnect did experience load shed. Some in the Southeast, some in Duke, North Carolina, the PJM areas. So you can imagine that load shed for a few hours, Christmas Eve, is not a very popular time to have load shed. It's not a good time to have load shed at all. But this was during an extreme winter weather event as well. And so while SPP avoided that load shed, there was localized load shedding that did occur on the Empire system that affected Empire District Electric Company and their customers in that 4-state region right there. And it was a transmission loading relief issue. It was a local reliability voltage issue. And so the reality is that the infrastructure in that area of the system needs upgrading. At least that's what the transmission plans show and the studies show. And it's a reliability project. At the end of the day, it's a winter weather driven resiliency reliability project to improve, basically to prevent what happened during Winter Storm Elliott from happening again with a repeat of that exact same storm. What they literally do is, data nowadays, right? They have hour by hour weather, wind, everything, all the transmission system interconnections, the how well the generators perform during that period of time. And they recreate that storm in year 2 and in year 5 of their models and say, would this transmission line prevent the outages that we had to experience on Christmas Eve, December of 2022? And the answer was yes, it does. And it does all these other reliability benefits too. And so that's the line. That's that Buffalo Creek to Delaware line that Evergy will be building. Well, not building. They have a notice to construct. They will be seeking a permission to build. They will be seeking a certificate, transmission rights only certificate, and a siting permit from the commission sometime later this year. So yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was alluding to. And thank you. I appreciate, number one, the granularity of your response. For me, the level of detail can't be too great. I appreciate that. And secondly, I appreciate your having separately provided us with some briefings on that latter circumstance. That's all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Justin, I don't have anything further. We do thank you for the presentation. if there's, I'm going to give this opportunity if anybody else has a question to pipe up. All right, I don't hear anything else. Thank you, Justin. With that, we have come to the conclusion of all the items noticed on today's business meeting agenda. If there's nothing further to come before us, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
I move that we adjourn.
Second.
Got a motion and a second to adjourn. All in favor, vote aye.
Aye.
Aye. We're adjourned. Thank you all. Take care.